Hello, today is Wednesday, February 20th, 2019. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm again joined by my LB3 senior partner colleagues, Laura McDonald and Kevin DiLallo, so that we can continue our discussion about the things to watch for in 2019 that will impact your technology and purchasing roadmap. If you missed our last podcast, we told you that the three of us recently wrote a paper that looks at the 10 things enterprises need to watch for in 2019. And we're discussing the various stories covered in that paper here on Staying Connected. On today's podcast, we'll discuss three more of the pieces. The first looks at the FCC's proposed new E911 rules. The second takes a look at an opportunity available if you're buying broadband services. And the third digs into the fight over net neutrality. Okay, Laura and Kevin, who wants to start us off? What's the FCC up to with the proposed new E911 rules?
Thanks again for having us, and I'm happy to kick off with regards to the E911 rules. Many states and foreign countries have enacted legislation and regulations imposing requirements for emergency calls. And the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and Congress have tried and are trying to address this issue as well. But the question is, are they creating confidence or more confusion? So right now, what we have is Congress enacted Ray-Bonds Act, essentially telling the FCC adopt rules requiring the transmission of accurate location with emergency calls, regardless of what technology is being used. Congress also passed Kerry's Law, which, among other things, attempts to standardize dialing for emergency services regardless of the location. The FCC is right now in the midst of a rulemaking proceeding to adopt regulations implementing these laws. An outcome will have significant impact on most businesses, not to mention equipment manufacturers and probably the telecom carriers.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. For enterprise customers and telecom carriers, the issue of emergency calling has always spawned arguments over who should be liable if an individual user requires emergency services and can't complete a call for help, or if the first responders can't find the caller in time. Telecom companies disclaim any responsibility for failures of emergency calling services, and they routinely try to make their corporate customers accept sole liability to both individuals and even the carriers themselves if something goes wrong with an emergency call. The pending FCC rulemaking could result in some ground rules for telecom providers, equipment manufacturers, and enterprise customers regarding their obligations and liability. FCC commissioners have repeatedly stated that enhancing public safety is a top priority, so we expect this otherwise deregulatory FCC to adopt rules that will definitely impact the business community. Several pro-business advocacy groups, most notably the Ad Hoc Telecommunications Users Committee, have filed comments urging the Commission to adopt common-sense, balanced rules that would protect the public without imposing unnecessary costs on businesses. For example, any rules that would require new or upgraded equipment, services, or software would need to be carefully tailored to serve the public interest without going overboard.
So, okay, Laura, what do you think the outcome will be at the FCC?
Let me check my crystal ball here. Actually, it's difficult to predict how the FCC's rulemaking will come out, but we do expect new rules later this year. And without question, the new regulations will affect every enterprise with multi-line telephone systems or VoIP systems. So that pretty much means every enterprise. So what can we do about it? In 2019, enterprises need to watch this rulemaking. They need to watch their contracts. They need to become familiar with issues and possibly make their views known to the FCC, because other than the ad hoc group, lots of times the FCC doesn't hear from businesses or doesn't understand how their rulemakings will impact them on a practical level. You also need, as an enterprise, to have a team ready to implement whatever comes out of the proceeding. And that team should work carefully with in-house counsel, with HR, with the procurement team to structure their network, their deals, and their policies.
Okay, next on our list today is looking at getting more bandwidth for your buck when you're buying broadband services. Now, I covered this topic with my TC2 colleagues Keith Cook and Mark Sheard a couple of months ago, but it's worth covering again because it can have a major impact on your broadband purchasing decisions.
Joe, I listened to that podcast, and what you guys said was that companies can basically buy a lot more broadband service for the same or a little bit more money, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that trend is going to continue into 2019. In fact, I'm seeing it with some client work that I'm doing right now. Enterprises, they're buying more internet transport because they can use different network edge technology. You don't need that expensive router any longer. There's a greater use of cloud services that don't require backhauling all the traffic to the data center. And solutions like SD-WAN, they're just generally enabling greater use of the hybrid WAN. So how does using internet transport benefit the enterprise? Well, what's happened over the last couple of years is that enterprises can buy broadband transport connections with up to 10 times the bandwidth that they currently use by paying the same or slightly more. So what that means, for example, that if a site upgraded from its current 10 meg broadband circuit to a 100 meg broadband circuit, they could do that and not blow the network budget.
Joe, like you, we get involved with a lot of global deals at LB3, and the ability to procure more bandwidth for the buck is not only a global trend, it's a business necessity. The pace of bandwidth increases for the same or lower cost, I agree with you, is likely to accelerate in 2019, regardless of whether it's a dedicated internet access circuit with bandwidths of 100 megs or more, or it's a lower speed business broadband based on the consumer type technologies. But just a quick caveat. As people are making this change and taking advantage of these lower prices, they need to make sure they're protecting themselves from hefty early termination fees and disconnects, not only for what they have right now, but what they may want to upgrade in the future.
A takeaway here is that enterprises will find that buying internet transport services will be somewhat easier in 2019. We're finding that there are a number of transport aggregator options that are now available. And honestly, many of the traditional telecom service providers are also starting to realize that this is a new normal for network services, and they are doing what they can to try to compete. Now, to benefit from this new network dynamic, what enterprises are going to need to do is develop a view of what their future state network is going to look like. And then they need to use it as the target for establishing the right bandwidth mix and then the suppliers that can provide the service. All right, the last story that we want to cover today is titled Net Neutrality Will Continue to Be a Battlefield. Now, I find net neutrality is such a hot button for so many people, but so few really understand what the issue is and who's fighting for what.
Joe, that's absolutely true. And it's absolutely true that the net neutrality wars will continue. For anyone out there that took a year off from the news, and hey, we wouldn't blame you for doing that, here's a quick update on net neutrality so folks can understand it. First, what is net neutrality? In short, net neutrality is the principle that all traffic on the internet should be treated equally and that ISPs, internet service providers, can't favor their own content over other people's content. So in 2015, the Federal Communications Commission adopted net neutrality rules to support these basic principles. In 2018, the FCC, which is led by a new chairman, different from the chairman in 2015, basically repealed the bulk of those rules and reclassified broadband so that it was subject to fewer regulations. Earlier this month, the D.C. Circuit heard an appeal, which included more than 4 hours of argument, and asked the FCC some pretty tough questions about whether the FCC's 2018 decision was justified. They also quizzed the appellants, those that were challenging the rules, which included 22 states and a number of consumer entities and corporate entities, on the rationale for reinstating net neutrality rules. And given the usual timeline, I would bet that the D.C. Circuit has a decision out on this summer.
Laura, this isn't just a consumer issue. Net neutrality is at least as important for enterprise customers because without net neutrality rules, ISPs can demand that a company pay extra for the bandwidth it needs to host a decent website that its customers can access and navigate without delays and without additional costs. That would be double dipping by the ISP because it's already receiving subscription fees from consumers. But in this case, both sides would be paying for the right to communicate over the internet. We all know, and studies confirm, that traffic delays hurt sales in online markets. An Amazon study found that every 100 milliseconds of latency costs it 1% in sales. And would the ISPs do it? You bet they would. Some ISPs have already expressed an interest in charging so-called gatekeeper fees, and historically, charging non-subscribers for access to subscribers has been the business model for both the telco and cable worlds. This explains why companies like Facebook, Netflix, and Amazon, as well as many small businesses, generally supported the original net neutrality rules.
As Kevin points out, the net neutrality rules put a check on the ISP's monopoly power, their control over their end user. How this will ultimately work out, that's unknown. My crystal ball is failing me yet again. What is known is that regardless of who wins the D.C. Circuit appeal, there's a lot of money at stake, and there will be an appeal to the Supreme Court and subsequent legal battles. And until settled, the market will remain subject to the tremors and uncertainties, and those can only be solved if the Supreme Court makes an ultimate decision, Congress passes legislation that the president will sign, and the only thing that enterprises can do in the meantime is trying to protect themselves through contractual processes or becoming involved in the legislative process.
So we're advising our listeners to keep an ear to the ground while net neutrality works its way through the court system. Make sure your internet access agreements stabilize your rates and don't allow your ISP to impose additional charges on you or on third parties to allow you to access any sites on the web or allow them to degrade the speed or quality of your internet connection relative to the level you enjoyed when you signed the contract, except as necessary for network maintenance.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, guys, again for joining me. The three of us will be back yet again to cover two more of the topics we wrote about in our paper about the 10 things to watch for in 2019. However, if you want to discuss E911, broadband purchasing, or net neutrality and how it might affect you, or if you have other ICT lifecycle needs, you can contact Laura, Kevin, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. You can also stay current by checking out our websites or follow us on LinkedIn.